Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. This week, America's Defense Secretary Ashton Carter made a 3-day visit to India to sign a new 10-year defense cooperation pact that will add further momentum to Indo-US ties. He also finalized 2 projects for joint development that will allow US firms to work very closely with Indian companies in line with Mr. Modi's Make in India initiative.
An earlier 10-year defense pact has helped the US become India's largest defense supplier in recent years. And Ashton Carter's visit, coming after President Obama's second visit to India, was to firm up a strategic partnership that will include military exercises and maritime cooperation. More specifically, the new Defense Trade and Technology Initiative will see the joint manufacture of mobile electric hybrid power source generators and high-tech protective gear for soldiers. Apart from the Raven mini UAVs and the electromagnetic aircraft launch systems EMALS for fighter jets operating from aircraft carriers. But these are indeed baby steps compared to the 5th generation fighter aircraft that India is developing with the Russians and earlier projects of the BrahMos missile. 60% of India's military equipment is still of Russian origin, a legacy of the Indo-partnership of the Cold War years. But with much of it having now become outdated, India is looking at new markets for weapons. Moscow has thus begun exploring new regional alliances with Beijing and Islamabad, offering to sell advanced M35 attack helicopters to Pakistan and striking a 30-year oil deal with China. And despite Western calls for Russia's isolation for its role in Ukraine, the presence of India's president and a marching contingent of the Indian Grenadiers at a grand parade in Moscow in May this year was perhaps to show the world that Indo-Russian ties are still unaffected.
The big question, however, amongst many observers is how will New Delhi balance out its earlier relationship with Moscow with its growing ties with Washington. We have with us 2 distinguished guests to discuss the subject: Ambassador Lalit Mansingh, former Foreign Secretary of India and also India's envoy to Washington, and Professor Bharat Karna of the Center for Policy Research, author and eminent strategic thinker. Ambassador Mansingh, sir, my first question: India and the US have moved visibly closer over the last few years, in fact a decade or more. Indo-US defense deals, India's nuclear deal with the United States, and more importantly, America talking about a strategic partnership with India. But Americans are known never to do anything for free. So what is it that America has in mind?
Well, you know, in international politics, nobody does anything for free. People guard their national interests, and every global power is doing the same. So we shouldn't be surprised if the Americans have their own agenda. The question is our agenda and their agenda coinciding? In that case, there is no harm in going ahead with a partnership. Now, the idea of a strategic partnership is not new. It's not coming up now. It's been there since the time of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and there's been a continuity in that. What has emerged now in the last 15 years or so is that the US has now become the principal strategic partner of India. In a group of about 25 to 30 countries with which we have the SPAs, the US is by far the most prominent strategic partner. And in a way, it's a kind of role reversal with the period of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was our principal strategic partner, and the US was a kind of was on the other side of the fence. And today, America is the principal strategic partner, and Moscow is slightly receding from that position.
Bharat, why do you think that India is moving so rapidly close to the Americans? Because you've written extensively about Indo-US ties, and you've not been always charitable about how things have evolved between India and the US, particularly that it seems to be all working to America's benefits to some extent, particularly in the area of defense partnership and defense deals? And do you feel there is more to the strategic partnership? Because at one stage you've also said that America will be reluctant to take part in disputes if India is involved, and certainly not put boots on the ground if historical evidence is anything to go by.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to, sort of talk about the strategic partnership with the United States as purely an arms supply relationship. Because if you reduce the partnership to just arms supplies, then you would still have a problem, because I think the US and Russia are not mutually exclusive in India's interests. We need to cultivate both Russia and the United States and to have strategic partnerships with both. Because even though in the last decade or so you have had, say, $10 billion worth of arms coming in from the United States, the bulk of armaments with the Indian military, all the three services, is still of Russian origin. And so Russia hasn't quite, the United States hasn't quite replaced Russia as our principal supplier, as some people think. On the ground, it's still the Russian armaments that we are working with, that are staple. And I think the thing that we have to manage, I think, is the US and the Russians have their own specific interests that they mean to service by partnering India. Both the US and the Russians, they are both equally apprehensive, I think, of China. So that's the common interest, I think, that ties us all together. Of course, Russia has its very serious differences with the United States. So what we have to do, I think, is ultimately do as we have done in the past, manage these two relationships to benefit our own interests and further our own interests. So if you're talking about a strategic partnership, these are both distant countries, and therefore geopolitically our interests don't clash, neither with Russia nor with the United States. And
Right.
therefore we are on good ground.
Yeah, well, thanks. Ambassador Mansingh, sir, it is said that America is often its worst enemy in defense deals because they lay out a long list of do's and don'ts for the services of the country concerned to follow. They have complicated certification requirements. They want various verifications from government. So in effect, and at the end of the day, they don't really give you the state-of-art equipment that you're really looking for, technology transfer promises notwithstanding. Whereas on the other hand, the Russians and the former Soviet Union are quite open to coming across in a relationship without all this baggage. What's your view?
Well, what you're telling about the Americans is an old story. So you have to look at the American behavior in terms of whether it is pre-2005 or post-2005. When we were under sanctions, it was difficult even to import a safety pin from the United States because they had a system of interdepartmental reviews and so on. Post-2005, most of those sanctions have been withdrawn. And the Americans are anxious to sell the high technology items that were forbidden to us earlier. There's another reason also. The Americans can't afford to be that picky because their economy needs business and they need to create jobs. And therefore, a lot of their conditions, which were so stringent during the Cold War period, have now been relaxed because they want the business. Secondly, Americans were considered unreliable because quite often they would stop the sale of spare parts, for instance, when we needed them. And they would say, Congress has told us that we can't do it. We are now finding a way out of that. When Mr. Modi says make in India, and you do the manufacturing in India as well as technology transfer, you can't very well deny the spares that are being produced in India. And therefore, we are finding a way around the American problem by, A, persuading them to open the doors wider, and secondly, doing the manufacturing ourselves here.
Bharat, your views from what I've read in your writings and your website are somewhat different, particularly in respect of what we can hope for from the Americans vis-a-vis the Russians. Can we have your take?
Well, yes, I think the Americans are going to be far more reticent in giving you the most advanced items that they have. Of course, I think Ashton Carter is offering emails, the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, for our new Mishal-class carriers we're going to build in home, in Cochin and elsewhere. The trouble, though, is emails is symbolically very potent, and it's supposed to address precisely this issue of Americans not transferring advanced technology. But it's impractical because on a 65,000-ton carrier, we don't have the energy pack, because the Americans are not going to help us to design and produce a nuclear power plant as our Navy would wish. So you are stuck with an offer that really is not realizable. But symbolically, as I said, it's a good gesture. More specifically, I think when you're talking about the Americans, the problem still exists of Washington demanding the foundational agreements. Ambassador Mansingh talked about, well, we have gone over the hump. We haven't actually. They still talk about foundational agreements as, well, preferred way of doing things. And I think so as you see, so far it's just straightforward FMS deals, whether it's for the C-17s, the C-30Js, and so on and so forth, or the P-8I, Maritime Reconnaissance,
But as you've written yourself, the real problem lies in the logistics support agreements.
Oh, absolutely.
And in those agreements, America could use the bases that India, if it were to provide, for all sorts of activities which we will not agree with.
Oh, absolutely. So, that's an open-ended kind of America benefiting system. If you have a logistics support agreement, you essentially mean that they're going to carve out part of your ports, part of your Air Force bases and so on for their exclusive use, as happens with the United States Air Force presence in Jacobabad in Pakistan, where the Pakistanis are not allowed. I don't think that sort of a thing will be acceptable to India.
Ambassador Mansingh, sir, the next question, what are the chances of Russia being peeved with India with this relationship with the US that has evolved over the last decade or so? And you've been one of those key players in the game, having been ambassador there. And Russia looking at a new relationship with China. They've signed an oil deal with China. They're also looking at supporting some elements of the Silk Route project. They're also looking at kind of a strategic alliance between Russia, China, possibly India. There is a nightmare scenario for the West. What are your views on that?
Well, it's not as if Russia is seeking a new relationship with China. Russia has established a new relationship with China. And that relationship is going against our interests. There was a time during the Cold War period when we had differences with the Chinese, and we got the Russians to support us. This was, in fact, one of the major reasons why we went deeper into a strategic partnership with the Soviet Union. Today, when we have a problem with China, a continuing problem with China, we are looking to the United States, not to Russia. Why? Because Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is not a superpower. Russia is a faltering economy. Oil prices are down. They have a serious economic situation. And Russia is looking to China to help Russia out. And therefore, instead of China trying to be a significant partner of Russia, Russia is happy to play second fiddle to China. So if you're asking the question, if we have a problem with China, will the Russians stand by us or with China? I think the answer is clear. They will certainly not stand by us.
But there's also a view that if we have a problem with China, the Americans will probably not stand by us.
Absolutely.
And I'd like Professor Karna to, you've again written about this, and to say that in the event of a crisis with China, or let's put it another way, that America has deeper engagement with China than it has with us in terms of business ties, and is obviously not willing to ruffle Beijing's feathers. Your view?
No, obviously. I mean, the question is, what are the interests that are committed interests? As far as the United States economy is concerned, for instance, the Chinese have $1.5 trillion worth of treasury bonds. In theory, they can really collapse the US market overnight. If they, so they won't do it because it's their money. and they're not foolish, but they could do it in theory. So these are the kinds of linkages they have that we can't just wish away. That said, I think the problem we have is that we cannot match China's economic muscle. And that's as true with the Russians as it is with the United States. Of course, they both want, both the United States and Russia would like us to buy hardware and pay in hard currency and so on and so forth. But China has a lot more of it than we do. But that doesn't in any way discount the fact that the Russians are suspicious of the Chinese for two reasons. They have their own problems on the Siberian border and the rest of the, in the Far East, where the Chinese are creeping in, demographic creep into their areas, and they're establishing a majority, or soon will. And the other is that the Chinese have invariably and inevitably reverse engineered everything that the Russians have given them. So even now, the Russians are happier selling to India than selling even at a markup to the Chinese. Because the next thing you know, they're going to reverse engineer and then sell it at a cheaper price to third world countries and so on.
Right, right. Ambassador Mansingh, again, going back to Russia and its strengths and its weaknesses, India and Russia have more recently focused on energy deals. Prime Minister Modi's visit to Russia also were looking at oil, nuclear energy, hydrocarbon arrangements, and a whole lot of other entities. But essentially, this comes at a time when India hasn't entirely abandoned its military relationship with Russia. It's developing a fifth-generation fighter with the Russians. We've already put in something close to 5 billion. We need to put in another 25 billion plus minus. We are also looking at naval equipment, ships, submarines, etc. So what do you make out of India's relationship with Russia as it stands today? What are your predictions for the next 5-10 years?
Well, I think the basic fact is that we have a shrinking relationship compared to the Cold War years. And we recognize that Russia cannot give us the kind of support that the Soviet Union could do. First of all, Russia doesn't have the global reach that the Soviet Union had, nor does it have the military strength of the Soviet Union. So we are looking at limited areas of cooperation, which is not necessarily strategic. Like there was a time when you could depend on the Russians to give you support on global issues. It is the Russians who helped us in the Security Council in vetoing all these resolutions that used to come up regularly on Kashmir. That is not going to happen. What is going to happen is selected areas have been identified to cooperation. Military cooperation is, yes, one of those areas, but that used to be a principal area of strength. But it's now a receding relationship in the sense that we have a bigger choice, we have a wider marketplace from where we can buy the best that money can afford. And what we are looking to Russia is certain specific items. Yes, fifth generation aircraft, yes. Nuclear submarines, yes. But in a wide range of other supplies that we need, we are going to other countries like the United States or Israel or other countries, number one. Number two, yes, energy is an important area of cooperation. But here again, it's been disappointing. We have been partners in the Sakhalin project. And much as we have tried to expand our reach in the market, in the Russian oil market, the Russians haven't allowed us to expand. Some talks have been held in December when Putin was here, but it has been disappointing. But the most disappointing thing has been the scale of the trade between us. Look at the comparison. We are stagnating with Russia at the level of $10 billion. And our announced goal is to make it $30 billion in 5 years' time. Our trade with the United States is $100 billion, and we are aiming to raise it to $500 billion in the next 5 years. So you can see how our interests have changed vis-a-vis Russia and the United States.
Professor Karna, you've written in the past to say that the politico-military value of Russia to India shall continue to grow. And a joint statement and a statement coming from President Putin's office which talked about Druzhba Dosti and talked about a strong strategic partnership keeping in view the national interests of India and Russia in mind. And they talked about this partnership. So where do you see India and Russia on the strategic plane in 5-10 years from now? And is the leaning that India is continuing to show towards the United States, is it something that you completely agree or disagree with?
No, look, I disagree with the reading that Russia is in some way greatly diminished in the international arena. Post-Crimea, it has been sanctioned, it has suffered a bit economically and so on. But the fact is that Russia remains the only credible military rival and competitor to America. There is no other. China is way, way behind in terms of advanced technology and the kind of strategic forces it can muster and so on. So the question becomes whether or not Russia will remain the main source of very advanced technology that we need, that we are not going to get from the Americans or anybody else, for that matter. Like, as I said, the Akula II class nuclear hunter-killer submarines. You're not going to get it from any places. The FGFA, yes, Ashley Tillis and so on have talked about the J-35C and so on coming in for the Navy use and so on. But look, J-35 is a hideous kind of project for us to get into. In any case, we are not really going to source great many frontline cutting-edge armaments from America in our inventory anytime soon.
Right. A lot of interesting points have emerged, and quite clearly the jury is still out in terms of how much India should lean towards either Washington or Moscow. Quite clearly, the US is today the most important strategic partner in Delhi's calculations, and this relationship with the US will certainly not be exclusive of other relationships. Russia does figure very clearly also in certain select areas of New Delhi's agenda, particularly in terms of technology transfers, military equipment, even possibly an energy relationship. But Russia has established strong ties with China, and this is something which is of concern to the international community, because Russia, China combined could create a regional power situation which is not going to be favorable to United States and its calculations, considering the fact that in some previous years the US had seen Russia as a diminished former Soviet Union. Equally important is India's relationship with Russia, which is different from the Cold War years, but Russia continues to remain the only serious military rival to the United States on the world stage, and is continuing to provide India certain technology transfers and military arrangements which India will find hard to get elsewhere on the terms that India is looking for. Thank you very much, sir, for both your views, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Latitude. Until then, goodbye.